This episode of the show is brought to you from the Salesman.org HubSpot studio. Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
Computer science is all about sort of articulating the limits of what can be computed or what can be computed with a finite amount of information or in a finite amount of time. So if you give people so-called optimal stopping problems in a lab setting, you find that they're very close to doing what the optimal algorithm would do. Computer science is really good at telling you how to optimize for a certain criterion, let's say. You have some quote-unquote objective function. How do you tune the parameters to maximize that?
Hello Sales Nation, my name is Will Barrett. I'm the host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most downloaded B2B sales show. On today's episode, we have Brian Christian. You can find out more about him over at brianchristian.com. And on today's episode, Brian and I are talking about algorithms, AI, human decision-making, the flaws in human decision-making, and a whole lot more. We're trying to answer the question, can computers and algorithms make better business decisions than what B2B buyers make regularly day to day? Everything that we talk about is available in the show notes of this episode over at salesman.org. And with that said, let's jump right into it. Brian, welcome to the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you on. I'm excited to have you on. This is, I'll tee it up like this for the audience, right? I've done 5 recordings today. I've got one more to do after this show. This is the most exciting show by far of the whole day, right? Because we're going to hopefully be able to bridge science and business. And clearly this is where business is going. Algorithms, AI, every product that salespeople use at the moment is, whether they're using AI or not, whether it's machine learning, we could perhaps get into some of this as well. But the audience are hearing AI, machine learning at all kind of places and all kinds of spaces within the sales industry. So with that said, we're going to talk about computers, algorithms, and decisions on this episode. So with that said, how good are humans at making decisions? Because we probably think that we're quite good at it, especially if we see some evidence in front of us. But how talented are humans generally at making decisions?
In broad strokes, I would say we're maybe better than we think we are. Okay. I think broadly there is a redemptive story that can be told about human decision-making and human rationality from computer science, of all places. I think we're familiar with the story that comes from behavioral economics that tells us about the ways in which we're, predictably irrational or loss-averse, et cetera, et cetera. And these, I think, have become quite familiar. But there is, I think, a different perspective that comes from computer science, which is to say, the problems that we face in life are just hard. And computer science is all about sort of articulating the limits of what can be computed or what can be computed with a finite amount of information or in a finite amount of time. And often what you find is that when you're up against the hardest classes of problems, what are called NP hard or intractable problems, you have to make shortcuts. You have to use approximation, you have to use randomness, and you have to kind of trade off the cost of thinking about something forever against the cost of making a mistake. And so I think what comes out of taking these computational constraints into account is a story about human rationality that makes our mistakes, more than sympathetic, but in some cases actually part of the optimal strategy for approaching these problems.
So I won't bore the audience of it, but me and you could probably have a good discussion about it. My dissertation at university was on computational chemistry and putting hacks into place for computer models of reactions and how to basically predict and use algorithms to kind of shortcut some of the data points of molecules moving and bouncing into each other and expansion and contraction of joints within the molecules themselves. So I could probably geek out with you on a deeper level, right, Brian, on all of this. But you said a few things here which are really important. And I guess a lot of this comes down to what we see is the computational power of the brain. So when you say for a computer to make these hard problems, we have to put shortcuts in there. Otherwise, it would take perhaps an infinite amount of processing power and an infinite amount of time to solve some of these problems. Does the brain because it seems like from the outside looking in, the brain can solve some of these issues, but are they just still using shortcuts and hacks in their own way with it, whether it be cognitive biases or being predictably irrational? Is the brain using shortcuts and hacks to make decisions as well?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You have to in many cases. And so the question is, are the shortcuts and hacks kind of well-tuned for the decision-making environment? And I think that's a very interesting question. So one of the things that I've been interested in my whole career is what is the dialogue between computer science and psychology? So as a computer scientist, you can study a certain type of problem. We can get into optimal stopping problems, multi-arm bandit problems. But then on the psychology side, what happens when you actually stick people in a lab and tell them, do your best here? What do you get? And we can dive into some of these examples, but at a broad level, I think what you find is that human behavior and the computational kind of gold standard diverge, but they often diverge in a way that reveals that we had kind of failed to model all of the relevant factors that are actually happening in a real human decision-making problem. One of them, for example, is the cost of time. So if you give people so-called optimal stopping problems in a lab setting, you find that they're very close to doing what the optimal algorithm would do, but they're a little bit impatient. But that makes sense. They're people. They're doing this very boring, repetitive laboratory study. They'd just as soon get out of there and be done. And so when you incorporate that time penalty into the optimal strategy, suddenly the gap between the computer and the person starts to narrow. So I think that's the kind of thing that builds my intuition that we're better than we often give ourselves credit for, I think.
Do we have to judge the decisions that computers can make differently to how we can judge how a individual makes a decision? And what I mean by that is, you kind of alluded to it there, a human decision is probably always going to be just good enough. I feel like this is just about right so I don't die, get attacked or those kind of decisions. We're on kind of a different hierarchy of needs versus a computer. A computer isn't thinking, hey, if I don't get this algorithm right, I'm going to get switched off and I won't get switched back on again. And obviously a computer algorithm, we're looking for yes or no, we're looking for 1 or 0 at the end of it. So do we have to perhaps judge how well we make decisions on either of these platforms slightly differently?
Yeah, I think, there are many salient differences, but the one that comes most to my mind is this idea, which you were sort of hinting at, of what ultimately is the objective that we're pursuing in a given decision-making context. Computer science is really good at telling you how to optimize for a certain criterion, let's say. You have some quote-unquote objective function. How do you, tune the parameters to maximize that? I think what's often going on in human decision making is that arriving at a formal articulation of what our goal even is most of the problem. I think that, for people with a machine learning background, one of the frontiers right now of machine learning is so-called reward modeling, which is trying to figure out how complex human preferences can actually be expressed as an objective function. And, in a more day-to-day context, anyone who's shopped for a house, for example, you often don't really know what your priorities are until you start evaluating things and you say, oh, you know what, maybe I really do care about space more than I thought I did because I'm not resonating with this particular house. So broadly speaking, I think, kind of the human predicament, but also the human genius in a way, is how do you operate in an environment where the objective function is not clearly expressed and you may have to actually figure out what your goals and priorities are along the way. To me, that's just a fundamentally different type of problem.
For sure. You're hitting the nail on the head here when buyers are selling complex products to sellers are selling complex products to buyers. A buyer will often say, well, I've got this problem, and it's the complex salesperson's responsibility. It's their job to go, well, maybe you think you have this problem, but really there's this, and this, and we need to sort it out on a deeper level. So the reason why I'm fascinated about decision-making and human decision-making, which seemingly is fundamentally going to be flawed because we can't have essentially infinite data points to make decisions upon, versus computer or algorithmic decision making, is that I see at some point in the future, and I've kind of joked about this over the years, but you can tell me if you think this would ever be possible. I think there's going to be a point where some sales could be replaced by your company has a database of problems that's been solved, has an API. The organization that you're selling into has all the data points across the organization, whether that be the products that they're selling, the customer service records, the logistics, the distribution, whatever it is. And they have a list of, algorithmic points that they want to improve on. You throw the two APIs together and magically we'll suss out whether one organization can actually help another. Am I talking absolute nonsense here, or is it a decision-making process like that which can be automated and essentially automates the sales process? Is something like that feasible?
I think it's not so far-fetched. I mean, there are certainly thinkers in the AI space that are prognosticating something like this. I'm thinking of Eric Drexler at Oxford has this vision for what he calls comprehensive AI services, which is very similar to what you're talking about. It's these sort of microservice architecture where all these different kind of AI components can talk to each other and put traits together, put deals together. I think at a practical level, there's always the risk that if the algorithmic piece, if the decision-making piece becomes so kind of static that it can be offered kind of as that product, there's always the risk that the company with the data can just build that decision-making, algorithmic component in-house or acquire that company or whatever. So I think long-term, my hunch is that the data will remain kind of the moat, and that the algorithmic part will become more commodified over time. But I could be wrong about that. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. I mean, right now, for example, it's still... So if you look at AI, like the OpenAI GPT system, for example, which does natural language completion, it's behind an API, it's paywalled, and that makes sense because it costs like $10 million to train that model. But on the other hand, $10 million is not prohibitive for many companies. So I think there is a long-term question in AI, which is like, what is the business model for artificial general intelligence? Will it be this giant monolithic thing? Will it be behind an API? Will everyone be able to roll their own? So your guess is as good as mine, but I think it's a very, very intriguing future, and it's coming faster than people, I think, appreciate. Yeah.
Sure. So, and maybe what we're talking about really is we would get a report printed, and then two humans would debate over the report, just try and justify it. And maybe there's a human element of human nature here that we want to negotiate, that we want to be involved in the process. So with that said, let's compromise there that perhaps there's AIs or APIs at all, an AI that can collaborate with organizations, they can pull data from either side, and there's a report that comes out of the back of it, whatever that looks like. I don't think that's totally unfeasible. So with that said then, how much does emotion ruin humans' ability to make decisions versus clearly computers don't suffer from emotions, not unless it's programmed into them anyway?
It's interesting because I think it really differs depending on what kind of decision you're making, right? So if you look at buying or selling a stock, right? If you're assuming that this is the normal world of fundamentals, and we're not talking about like GameStop,
the Reddit crew,
wild momentum strings. If you're looking at the actual fundamentals of an asset, your emotional attachment because some brand was nostalgic to you or whatever, that really is essentially irrelevant. On the other hand, if you look at something like buying a house, your idiosyncratic emotional reaction to like, it's a clawfoot tub. I've always wanted a Well, in some ways, that is what you're buying, is the feeling that you're going to have, the actual experience of being in that space. And so I think we have to kind of try to tease apart the cases where the emotions are intrinsic to the actual value of what you're deciding and cases where they aren't. Yeah.
How predictable are people's emotions, and from that standpoint, say that so the audience of B2B sales, but perhaps we are selling a house for whatever reason, right? How could we pull enough data in and know that 27% of people are going to love this bathtub? Are people on a large enough scale, are their emotions predictable at that level?
I mean, certainly if you look at the way that tech companies do A/B testing, Google famously tried out 41 shades of blue for one of their buttons in order to figure out which one was, the most clickable. And at that scale, when you're dealing with hundreds of millions, billions of users, you can really kind of tease apart these impacts. I think with something like, the smaller the amount of data points that you have, the harder it's going to be. And so I think, if you're selling, aerospace things or whatever, there's only so many buyers or whatever. So it's not like you can just A/B test different prices and, let the statistics kind of sort themselves out downstream. And yeah, with houses, it's also, every asset is idiosyncratic. And so you could debate about how far to extrapolate certain patterns. So I think there is, in a way, a gulf that starts to open up between the companies that have the luxury of being able to offer, a single experience to a billion people and kind of take the scientific approach versus areas where, it's you have a little bit more of a small data problem and you have to make the most of those small data points.
Is there any data research or evidence on the idea of wanting to make decisions, I guess, how to frame this up, make a decision with another person, or the trustworthiness of data from a person versus from an algorithm, or like kind of the AI report that we were talking about earlier on? Is where does trust fit into all of this?
I think trust is critical, actually. So if you look at game theory, there's this idea in game theory of what is called strategic behavior. And it's funny because in the game theory community, strategic has like a pejorative connotation. It basically means insincere. And there is a whole kind of subfield of game theory called mechanism design, which you can think of as the reverse game theory. So if game theory asks, here's a game, what's the right strategy to play? Mechanism design goes the other direction and says, there's a certain kind of behavior that we have in mind. How do we create the right game such that we incentivize that behavior? And so there's a lot of really interesting literature in mechanism design on this idea of being strategy proof. How do you create a game where the winning strategy is to be completely honest and completely sincere? And, in an auction, how do you make an auction such that the winning strategy is to bid exactly your kind of reserve price? And it turns out there are actually ways to do this. There's a so-called victory auction where the winner is the person who makes the highest bid, but they only pay the price of the second highest bid. And it turns out, you can prove theorems about this, that the optimal strategy is to bid exactly your kind of reserve price. And so there's a lot of really interesting work there about, incentivizing honest behavior. I think where the trust part comes in, there's this idea called the revelation principle, which is the theorem that basically says you can convert any game that has this strategic behavior into one that just incentivizes optimal behavior, essentially by having a go-between, like an agent that you whisper into your agent's ear, here's what I really think, here's what I really want. And then that agent can do the strategic part on your behalf. So this theorem is basically like if you put that agent into the game itself, then the game becomes strategy proof. But that requires trust, right? So some marketplace, whether it's eBay or Zillow or whatever, could say, hey, we've created this, trusted agent that will do the negotiating on your behalf. You can use the revelation principle. Just tell us exactly the maximum amount that you'd be willing to pay. And don't worry, we'll do everything we can to optimize, the best deal possible. At that point, it's not really about game theory anymore. It's really about trust. And so there are these really wonderful results that you can prove on a whiteboard, but at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you actually feel that you can be honest with that intermediate or not? And so I think that's critical.
So I'm going through exactly this at the moment. I'm trying to buy a domain name, a very expensive domain name. And there's an agent who's representing the seller. Now, the agent clearly makes a commission on the deal. So I guess there's two ways that we can frame this up. One, if there's no deal, he makes no commission. or the other way of looking at it is, if there's going to be a deal, then he wants to raise the price as high as possible because I assume it'll get a percentage of the deal that's done. Now, in the situation that we're in, there's only us that's going to buy this domain. We're the only people that have inquired about it for like 5 years. People will know, the audience will know, we're called salesman.org. People will know the domain that we're talking about here, but it's incredibly expensive. And so I'm waiting for a prime opportunity to make a decent offer, such as a global pandemic. So I'm going back and forth with him, but I do not trust this fella as far as I could fling him, Brian. So is there any way that, say like we were the brokers and we wanted to be that agent, and we're only talking about being fair, we're being down in the middle. Is there anything that we could do to influence perhaps my decision making on, I'm choosing to decide that this guy is trying to rip me off? Is there anything that literally he could do to improve his business practices to make me feel more trusted in the kind of relationship that we're built, and to make me feel more secure in the decisions that I'm making?
It's a really interesting question. It's easier. It's one of these things, going back to what we were saying just a moment ago, it's easier to do it at scale than it is to do it at a small scale. So, one of the people that I've interviewed, for my book was Hal Varian, who is the chief economist at Google, who helped set up the Google ad auction experience. And one of the, I think, critical insights that Google had was that they would make more money with a victory auction, a second price auction, because of the trust component, than they would with a first price auction, your more sort of traditional auction. The idea being they wanted to lower the psychological friction that buyers would have and make it easy for, companies to place ads and feel like they didn't have to have some meeting on their end about what price to try to set based on their perception of how competitive that keyword was, etc. Google would just do it for them. So that's a good example of how you can make that choice, but it requires there to be at least one other buyer. And so you're in a very funny position, and in kind of an unenviable position, because there's not a second price to kind of set that off of. I think, I don't have a magic bullet. I sympathize with the situation that you're in. I'll tell you that.
Is there any time that, because it seems like scale is the answer to a lot of this, right? Almost everything that we've gone through so far, Google wins at scale. The amount of data that they have, the amount of experiments that they can do, and the amount of just like tiny iterations they can have over the course of years or even decades. It's just going to wipe the floor with someone who's trying to do some of this on a smaller level. Are we getting to the point now where, I think you mentioned earlier on, this idea of like the moat, where the more data you have, the bigger the moat becomes? Are we getting to the point where at some point Google will just have a marketplace for B2B products? Everything will just be bought through there. It'll be so seamless that you don't need salespeople anymore. I know I'm kind of like throwing a lot at you here, but is that kind of thing the likely future for B2B decision makers and B2B purchases?
That's a great question. I don't have a strong intuition there. I mean, I guess it does come back in my mind to this question of scale, because not everything can be a big data problem, And so I'm just thinking, for example, in the AI community, there's a lot of conversation about drug treatment optimization. There are a lot of algorithms, for example, in the reinforcement learning community for playing Atari games that say, we can prove theorems about how quickly you can converge on an optimal strategy, provided you're willing to fail hundreds of thousands of times. But that's not an attractive pitch if you're, thinking about treating a serious illness. And so I think those cases where we can't iterate because the stakes are too high, or because the phenomenon is too rare, or the duration is too long, right? So if you're doing a course of treatment that requires 20 years to, find out what happened, or you're trying to decide who should go to a certain college and you have to wait 20 years to see how they flourished in life, you don't have this tight feedback loop where you can just sort of iterate. So I do think that those sorts of cases will distinguish themselves from the cases where you can just sort of the unreasonable effectiveness of data kicks in.
And how much of this comes down to culture? What I mean by that is, 5 years ago, I would probably be more than happy to go, say I was ordering, so we just got a new puppy. So perhaps I was ordering something for the dog, right? I don't know, a toy, whatever it is. I'd be more than happy to go on Google, and Google still own everything that we're doing here, right? I'd go onto Google, and I'd probably click all of the ads that's at the top, and I'd search for a toy, and whoever's kind of bidded second best on that would get my attention, and then I'd go to a website. Now, though, I just go through Amazon. I don't go anywhere else ever to buy basically anything other than Amazon. And clearly this is a cultural shift that Amazon just created such a beast of a machine that they can provide so many options at such a good price with such fast delivery that it makes no sense to go anywhere else. So how much of all of this that we're describing here and these I guess anecdotes that I'm throwing at you, how much of this changes over time when perhaps the algorithms aren't really changing, but are the human decision to use them is?
Say that again. I want to make sure I understand where you're coming from.
Okay. So we'll use the example of Google open a B2B marketplace. So right now, there will be a lot of people that go, no, I want to speak to an actual human, regardless of what the data says, regardless of what Google can throw in front of me, regardless of the we will do X% increase in revenue by using this product via Google. A lot of buyers, and this is it's a age, experience, culture. There's multiple variables here. A lot of people would go, I want to speak to someone on the phone. I would probably say, I want to chat to someone on live chat or I want to email them. And so my younger brother might say, well, I don't want to do anything. I just want to install it and then never think about it ever again. So how much of, regardless of how good the algorithms are making decisions and helping us, how much of the use of them that we make, it comes down to humans and their opinions on things?
Yeah, I mean, I guess where my mind goes to that with that is this question of algorithmic art, right? So people are talking about AI is getting so good it can just generate infinite amounts of music. The music can be perfectly tailored to your preferences, your tastes. I'm very much not persuaded that that's going to take over the music industry for a couple of reasons. I mean, you think about the way people talk about wine, for example. A lot of the interest that people have in wine is, I went to the vineyard, I met the people, they were really nice, they told me this cool story about the history of the land, or they have this particular idiosyncratic practice that they use, and it was really cool, and this reminds me of my trip there. I think that ends up being really relevant. I think with art, a big part of what we appreciate about art, which is, I think, not currently being modeled by recommender algorithms, is the sort of Schelling point of like, there's this cultural thing that has this, sufficient gravity that it becomes the thing that we talk about that year or that month. And it doesn't really matter what it is, but you want to be a participant in a social experience. And so the idea that algorithms will recommend some super niche thing that's custom tailored for your preferences, well, that's a lonely experience if no one that you know has watched that film or heard that song or whatever. And in some ways, what we really want is to be part of the cultural conversation around that thing. So I think there are a lot of cases like that where underneath the ostensible optimization is really this human impulse to connect, right? To connect with the creator, to connect with, your fellow consumer, sports obviously being an example like that as well. So I think optimization, needless to say, has a role to play, but it's far from the only story. And I think in some ways it reveals to us that there is this kind of inimitable human core, behind it all.
I love this. As you're saying that, Brian, what I'm getting from it is I would love to know if we could survey everyone in the B2B buying marketplace. I would love to know how many people have buyer's remorse of buying something just because they thought it was cool. They didn't understand it. It wasn't a good decision. They weren't spending their own money. They were spending the organization's money. They bought it because they thought it was cool, or they liked the person on the other end of the phone, or someone came in and the salesperson was flirting with them, whatever it was. I would love to know how many buying decisions were just terrible decisions and were only completed because of essentially both human flaws and then the things that make us human as well.
Yeah, that's a great question, and yeah, I mean, it's a reminder that, as you say, you're not only representing your own interests in many of these cases, and I think that's one of the complicated things, is realizing that you're making decisions on behalf of a huge group of people that may not have your idiosyncratic fondness for whatever it is. I remember, for example, a story told to me by my friend Mike Krieger, who's one of the founders of Instagram, and he was saying, they had a choice between starting their first remote office in Seattle or New York, and he picked New York just because he personally likes New York and he wanted to spend more time there. But this had, ramifications across the entire culture in terms of, there was now a time zone gap or things like that. So I think it ended up, working out in the long run. But I think that's a great example of how, we can't help but, become, I don't know, personally involved in the decisions that we make, even when, we're making it on behalf of a large organization. It's very hard to take the impersonal view even then. I mean, of course, you try to factor that in, but yes, we are human.
I love it. I've got one final question for you, Brian. So I know you are not a salesperson, but clearly you've sold books and you've sold ideas and concepts, and you've sold us on some of the things that we talked about today. So I know you're not an out-and-out salesperson, but I'm sure you have an answer to this. Ask everyone that comes on the show this, Brian. If you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I think the thing that I really would want to say to my former self is to just be more comfortable in his own skin. There's a certain leap of faith that one makes that one is not alone in the universe, that there are people, you may think of yourself as kind of weird or idiosyncratic in certain ways, but it's very likely that the precise ways in which you feel sort of alienated or out of the mainstream represent this untapped market, this cultural shift in the zeitgeist, and an opportunity to sort of speak to an audience or a market that has been kind of underserved, rather than just sort of following the mainstream or following what you think the supposed market wants. So just to be a little bit more assured in trusting your own inner compass, I think that would have served me well in hindsight.
Is that something you've learned over time with experience, or did you have a moment where that smacked you on the back of the head and you were like, oh, this is what we need to be doing moving forward?
I don't know if there was a single moment. I think for me, it's this idea that I write books for a living, so I think of my books as my product, and if you want to think about it that way. Each book is like a message in a bottle that you throw out to sea. That you hope someone somewhere is going to read that message, and maybe you'll never meet them, maybe you will. The thing that I think is critical is not to necessarily imagine an audience in advance, but to realize that whatever that thing is, it will find its own audience. So if you write a really funny book, then people who are looking for something funny are going to resonate with that. If you write a very erudite book, then scholarly people are going to resonate with that. And the world is big enough that whatever you do, as long as it's authentic, there is going to be an audience there on the other side, but the audience will be different. And so, yeah, maybe not to sweat it so much. And the more authentic that you are, the more that the type of people who resonate with what you're putting out will be the kind of people that are simpatico with you. And so you will draw a community towards yourself of people with whom it's that much easier to be yourself, that much easier to sort of, let your guard down, be natural, and kind of let your intrinsic gifts show themselves. And so, yeah, I think there's a compounding effect, I guess is what I'm trying to say, that, and this goes back to this question of what I would say to a younger self. In some ways, I would hesitate to tell my younger self this because it would maybe raise the stakes when you're young, you think, yeah, I'm 23. Let me go live abroad. Let me go try this career. We'll just see what happens. Things feel kind of low stakes. And I think that's good. But what I didn't appreciate at that time in my life is that there's a compounding effect for every choice that you make. You move abroad, but then you meet your spouse, and now that's your entire life is going to happen in that country now. Or you write a book about a certain topic, and then that brings an audience to you that makes it, the certain opportunities then follow from that, or certain relationships follow from that. So you kind of set in motion with these early decisions this compounding effect. And so the more sincere you are, or the more kind of authentically you're acting, the more that compounding effect is working in your favor, and it's going to make it easier to succeed going forward. So I think that's broadly applicable, I think, in any career.
For sure. So I talk about it all the time in our training project over at salesman.org, this idea of second, third, fourth, fifth order consequences of that you buy a bookshelf or do you buy a TV? You buy a TV and you're like, oh, great, I can watch Game of Thrones again, even though the ending was terrible. And then you go, well, now I've bought a TV, I should probably watch something else. And you've now second, third, fourth order consequences. You now have pizza three nights a week. You watch loads of crap. You don't get anything done. Obviously, this is massively stereotypical, right? You buy a bookshelf. Now you go buy books because you want to fill the bookshelf. It looks ridiculous with no books in. You start reading them and you get more, perhaps, not necessarily, but perhaps more positive second, third, fourth order consequences, all from just one single decision that kind of stems outwards.
I think that's critical to keep in mind, and all the more so in this era of machine learning, AI, recommender algorithms. Every YouTube video that you watch creates fifth order consequences of what videos you'll be presented with in the future. And so you're acting on behalf of your future self, because you're going to constrain your future choice architecture in ways that are probably inscrutable at a fine grain level, but we can sort of see the broader trends.
That is a conversation for another time, because what books I buy now, Amazon's going to show me different books relating to those in the future. And Amazon might screw me over. Amazon might go, hey, we don't like the content that you're pointing out. You mentioned us on the show in a negative light. And so we're going to start messing with the algorithms and throwing nonsense and terrible books your way. So again, a conversation for another time, but I guess there's a dark side to some of this as well. So with that, we've touched on, I barely scratched the surface of Algorithms to Live By, one of your books, but tell us more about the books and where we can find out more about yourself, Brian.
Yeah, sure. So I've written 3 books so far. The most recent is called The Alignment Problem, Machine Learning and Human Values, which looks at some of these questions of how do we get human desire, human values, human objectives into machine learning systems, whether they're recommender systems or whatever it might be. And if you want to learn more, that book just came out a few weeks ago, and you can go to brianchristian.org, or I'm on Twitter @BrianChristian.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll link to all the books, your website, your Twitter, everything else over at salesman.org in the show notes to this page, show notes for this episode. And with that, Brian, I want to thank you for 2 things, mate. I really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully the audience did as well. And I want to thank you for taking a bit of a punt and coming on a business show to talk about AI and decision making. I think the audience will have got a lot of value out of this, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us, mate.